Welcome back as we track a tornado for you through Iowa, moving east at 25 miles per hour. A tornado warning between Cedar Rapids and Dubuque. In Delaware, Dubuque, and Jones counties, we have a tornado warning for you that goes until 6:45 this evening. Multiple confirmations of this. 4 different confirmations of tornado touchdowns with a cycling supercell here. Touchdown and lifted around Prairieburg, 6:08. So that's about 12 minutes ago. And this storm has had a history of producing tornadoes, so no need to think that it will stop. It's in a very favorable atmosphere for continuation. And notice here, we've got Monticello, 6:37 could be coming your way, but Dubuque, 7:37. If this supercell holds together, could certainly be impacting you here. Please take it seriously. If you're in the path of this tornado, take shelter right away. And there's also a newly issued tornado watch for a small area here. It includes east central, I'll say, and eastern Iowa. That goes until 10 o'clock Central Time tonight. We'll keep you up to date on the severe storms in the Midwest, but our top threat tonight is Tropical Storm Gordon, emerging off Florida's coast and headed through the Gulf of Mexico. Let's talk with Dr. Knabb about the threats that go beyond a landfall. We know where this thing is tracking toward, the northern Gulf Coast here, and obviously there'll be concerns along the Gulf Coast. You've talked a lot about that, but this thing will go interior as well and pose a risk.
Yeah, this is not just going to be a coastal event. Now, it's a good thing that it's moving quickly, so that limits the time over water for it to strengthen, but a faster moving storm or hurricane brings stronger winds farther inland, so that's not a good thing. And then it will slow down somewhat and bring the threat for inland flooding. So, but the stronger it gets over water, the stronger the winds will be at the coast and spreading inland. Then we got to deal with the flash flooding. And yes, it's going to be a problem farther inland, but look, just talking about tomorrow night into Wednesday morning, around the time of landfall. You know, the Mississippi coastline has the storm surge warning.
Right.
Could get 3, 4, 5 feet above normally dry ground, the salt water. Combination of surge and tide. But this is also an area where there's a pretty significant shot at getting flash flooding from the fresh water. And then look how far inland those tropical storm force winds could extend along with the heavy rainfall. So power outages, flooded roads for hundreds of miles after landfall.
It could get messy in a lot of different places far from the coast, that's for sure. We know the hurricane warnings are in effect right now for Gulfport, Mississippi. That's where we find the director of the Harrison County Emergency Management Agency, Rupert Lacey. Rupert, thanks for being with us this evening live. Let's talk about what's going on there in coastal Mississippi. Could get really active here the next 24 hours. What's the plan now?
Of course, one of the biggest plans, and as y'all have been doing for the last couple of days, is that we want to make sure that our guests and our residents along the Mississippi Gulf Coast are prepared for, as you were just talking about, that rain event, that flash flooding event, that storm surge, and then we'll top everything with a little bit of wind.
So, Rupert, tell everybody about what the clearance times are and how long you have to get everybody out from the time you might have to make an evacuation decision, and who's under evacuation orders right now, or who might be later that you're contemplating.
We have no evacuation orders right now in Harrison County. Of course, as we start to look at that 10 o'clock advisory coming out, we'll start to lean heavily to those people living in low-lying areas. And of course, we'll shut the sand beach off, those areas tomorrow that we'll want to keep people away from the water's edge, shall we say. Of course, the rain event, we've got those 3 rivers in the county that you're quite aware of, Dr. Knabb, that we're looking at and thinking about that riverine flooding. We're getting ready to put out some advisories and some notices on that. That we're looking for those to come up. The key thing is in putting people into shelters, we're going to lean heavily on putting people into shelter later on.
All right, Mr. Lacey, thank you for your time this evening. We'll be right back with more on Tropical Storm Gordon right after this.
Tropical Storm Gordon really whipping up the winds. The wind and the rain has been unrelenting.
That right there, some of the early impacts of Tropical Storm Gordon, newly named this morning and intensifying and likely to become either a strong tropical storm or hurricane by the time it makes a landfall on the northern Gulf Coast. Thanks for being with us in the live coverage here on the Weather Channel. I'm meteorologist Mike Bettis. Let's update you on the latest advisory we have from the National Hurricane Center as of 5 o'clock Eastern time. Winds at 50 miles per hour. We're going to get another update here in less than half an hour here, so expecting the 8 o'clock Eastern time advisory here shortly. Winds 50, west-northwest movement at 17 miles per hour, 1,006 millibars. So we'll see with the next advisory how much this changes and if there's any intensification whatsoever with this tropical storm. But we know that Florida's already been dealt a hard blow today. And how about this video? A driver going by here in Miami spots this crane that's been tipped over. We had really strong wind gusts this morning in South Florida. Don't know for sure if that was the cause here, but certainly didn't help. We had wind gusts as high as 45, sustained winds as high as 45 with gusts that were higher than that. Down in the Keys, we had wind gusts 65 miles per hour. Let's bring in meteorologist Mike Seidel. He's joining us live tonight from the other side of Florida. Mike, this morning you started on the East Coast. Now you're on the West Coast. Describe how the weather has progressed through the day today in South Florida.
Well, basically, what we had this morning in Key Biscayne is what we had this afternoon and just up to about an hour ago here in Naples. So we just basically followed the action on the Alligator Alley, I-75. Let me take you back to this morning. This is Key Biscayne. This is southeast of downtown Miami, and we're fully exposed to the elements. There's nothing blocking the wind and the rain coming in at us. And you can see how hard it is raining. I mean, it was coming down in buckets, and this is when that 56-mile-an-hour wind gust was clocked at a Mesonet station just a few miles off Miami Beach, South Beach, which is north of where we were standing. So we wrapped up there at 11, hopped in the car, grabbed a meal, drove over here, and then we find the squalls battering us over here. Now, we didn't have quite as much wind, and over the past couple of hours, we've had some heavy rain, but not terrific amounts of wind. The peak gust at Naples Municipal Airport, 37 miles an hour. You can see cars driving through the flooded boulevard right out here from where we are here at the beach. So the worst of it here in South Florida, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Miami-Dade, Broward counties, and over here in Lee and Collier counties, one, heavy rainfall, localized flooding, urban flooding, but I've not seen any flash flood warnings today anywhere in South Florida or Southwest Florida. And as far as cleanup goes, picking up some palm fronds. That really is the extent of it. There was no coastal flooding. There was no surge issues. There was no sand left behind, unlike what we saw 50 weeks ago today, basically at this hour from Hurricane Irma. So it's moving on out. We still have the one cell out here, Dr. Nab, with some lightning. We may get another shower or two, but the worst is over here. Now all eyes are watching the Gulf of Mexico and the satellite imagery, and you're watching what's coming in from the NOAA and also the Air Force Hurricane Hunter aircrafts. They're out there looking at Gordon. Any updates on what has come in electronically over the past, say, half an hour or so?
Yeah, we're double dipping. Got the NOAA Hurricane Hunters, the P3 flying at about 10,000 feet, and the Air Force WC-130 flying at about 5,000 feet. Obviously, coordinating there so they don't run into one another, and both sending the data in real time. Now, at 5 p.m., the advisory intensity was 50 miles an hour, and that was in between aircraft flights. So now the aircraft are out there, and Hurricane Center forecasters pouring over that data, and then within the half hour here, they will issue the intermediate public advisory. So the NOAA plane, taking off from their base in Lakeland, flew from the southeast to the northwest, and then the Air Force Hurricane Hunters took off from Keesler Air Force Base, and they've gone from northwest to southeast. Now, preliminarily looking at a combination of the flight level data and the surface wind speed estimates from the SFMR, which is the Stepped Frequency Microwave Radiometer. That's alphabet soup for a system that can remotely estimate the wind speeds at the ocean surface from a microwave instrument looking down from the belly of the aircraft, and the ocean sends up microwave signals that can be converted into wind speed. Based on everything I'm looking at, the storm does look stronger. It's probably stronger than 50 miles an hour. It might be, say, around 60 plus or minus, but I will put in the caveat that the Hurricane Center forecasters are in direct communication with the aircraft, and they will have to interpret those data, see if there are any biases or problems with those data, and we'll see what they do with the intermediate public advisory. But it does look to be on the strengthening trend. That is actually what is forecast, Mike.
All right, Dr. Knapp, thank you for that very much. We know that this thing could really pose some risks to the Gulf Coast, right? And for those of you that could be in the forecast track of this, you need to take it very seriously. I know it's probably the last thing you wanted to do on a holiday weekend. It's a Monday. I had a great day off, a great weekend off, and I had no idea this was even coming. So now it's very, very important to understand what the threats are and when those threats will be coming your way. Take a look at this. By tomorrow morning, notice this black dashed line right here. We could be looking at tropical storm force winds now coming into the panhandle of Florida by tomorrow morning. And then by tomorrow at 2 p.m., we could be looking at tropical storm force winds coming into Pensacola, Mobile, close to Pascagoula, or even down through the marshes in the coastal areas here of Louisiana. So that means winds now are going to be around 40 miles per hour with gusts higher than that. And then probably sometime around maybe 6 o'clock, somewhere in there, a place like New Orleans, tropical storm force winds could be coming your way. So this thing's moving pretty quickly, and you're not going to have a lot of time between now and then to keep your preparations done, to get your preparations done. Here's a look at our forecast, all right? Present time, and we're going to go hour by hour through this. Should stay relatively light winds along the Gulf Coast through tonight, but notice how they quickly ramp up tomorrow, and by tomorrow night, midnight, look at this. Gulfport could be looking at 75 mile per hour wind gusts, 50 mile per hour wind gusts in Mobile. And so this is going to be closer. These two locations, at least at this point, are forecast to be closer to the center of circulation, which puts you closer to the higher wind danger. And then as it goes farther inland by Wednesday evening, the winds taper off quite a bit, but still breezy, though, in a place like Gulfport and Mobile right through Wednesday morning, afternoon, and early evening. Now, if the winds from Gordon knock out power, you're not at a complete loss. Mark Elliott shows us some hacks if you lose electricity.
So here you are walking through your house, minding your own business when some weather comes through and out goes the power. Now, if you're like me, the first thing you do is try to find the flashlight to illuminate your way, but who wants to hold one of these all day long, pointing it every which direction to find what you're looking for? Here's a better way. You can hang the headlamp or the flashlight right onto a gallon of water, puts a nice soft glow in the room, and now you can see hands-free. Now, batteries are the nemesis in a power outage. Maybe your weather alert radio calls for AA's, but all you've got are AAA's. We can actually fix that too. Put a little bit of tinfoil in the gap for the battery size, and it still works. May not last as long, but it'll get you by in a pinch. Speaking of a pinch, you might finally want a hot meal. You're done with takeout? Use the pizza box as a solar oven with just some tinfoil and some saran wrap. You can have a hot meal right there on your own driveway. Hey, the power's back on. But is anything in here good to eat still? Well, we can do a little test for you. Put a mason jar with some water and food coloring horizontally in your freezer, then stack it vertically. If that defrosts, the shape of the ice changes, you'll know that nothing in there is safe to eat. And that's some ways that you can get through your next power outage.
Good stuff there. I really like the one about the batteries for sure. All right, Dr. Knapp back with us again. We're answering your questions this evening about Tropical Storm Gordon, and you're sending to them via Twitter. Thank you, Amber, for sending this one. What mile per hour wind gust and how many inches rain should we be expecting in Mobile, Alabama?
Well, you're under the threat of wind and water, and the Alabama, Mississippi coast, let's take a look at those watches and warnings, right? This is an area that's under hurricane warning. So you could get sustained winds of 75 miles an hour or greater, and gusts could be higher than that. And the sustained winds could be greater than that if it comes in stronger than forecast. And you're on the right-hand side of the cone, so there's a decent chance of being on the stronger side of this. Very high chance of getting sustained winds of tropical storm force and maybe even sustained winds of hurricane force, power outages, and if you're near the bay, possibility of storm surge.
Flooding rain possible there as well?
Also is possibility.
All right, Dr. Knapp, thank you. Amber, thank you for your question. We're back after this. Thanks for staying with us here on the Weather Channel. Tornado warning continues for us in Iowa tonight. Storm getting closer and closer to Dubuque. In Delaware, Dubuque, and Jones counties, we have tornado warning. If If you're in Cascade or Hopkinton, Monticello, please take shelter. 6:45, the expiration on this tornado. 4 different reports of a tornado touchdown on both sides of I-380. Tornado touchdown and lifted back up. In Prairieburg was the newest report that we got. Let's track this out for you. And Monticello around 6:47, so that's going to happen shortly. Actually, a tornado could go maybe just north of there, but maybe somewhere between Dyersville and Monticello here, a place like Dubuque. It's going to be a little while. We'll see if this thing holds together until then, but keep a really close eye on it. And our tornado watch extends until 10 o'clock tonight for east central Iowa, meaning conditions favorable right now for tornadoes to form. Let's get back to our top story. Is a tropical storm Gordon. Paul Goodlow joining us live from New Orleans tonight. Paul, you've got new information tonight on closures.
Yeah, closures are being announced left and right. We started with schools, of course, that's a concern. No word yet on New Orleans City schools, but I do know that Jefferson Parish schools, as well as Lafourche Parish schools, Lafourche Parish schools also closed for Tuesday because they want people to have no excuse to prepare as Gordon comes this way. There are voluntary evacuations now for Grand Isle, Louisiana, as well as voluntary evacuations for areas outside the levees here in the city of New Orleans. So not everyone is protected by the levee system. Most are, but some are not. So they're not making you leave, but if you want to leave, you definitely should if you do not feel safe, because that's the big concern here, is not so much storm surge. It is a concern, but it's the heavy rain threat, and this city is a city that sits below sea level. We have Lake Pontchartrain to the north. We have the Mississippi River here, right to the right of me here. And as the city starts to sink, the pumps there, they can pull out rainwater at a rate of 1 inch an hour. If you get 1 inch of rain an hour, it's good for the first hour. After that, it's a 1/2 inch of rain per hour it can pull out of the city. So if we get a persistent heavy rain band, that could cause some flooding. And by the way, there were several instances last summer where just general summer thunderstorms, again, we're right on the Gulf of Mexico, brought some flooding here in the city as some of the pumps were not working properly. So that's always a big concern when you're relying on a machine to keep this city flood free. So that's a big concern for many people here across the area. The governor of Louisiana is still telling people, hey, don't let your guard down. The worst is yet to come, so be prepared for that as well. And by the way, Mike, state of emergency has been declared for this state by the governor as well. So the National Guard has been activated, and I love that because they are preparing for the worst. Of course, we're hoping for the best, and hopefully we won't have issues here in Louisiana as well as New Orleans, but I'm thinking we'll have some, but hopefully they'll stay on the minor side. Mike?
Well, we're hoping that forward speed, being so fast, will benefit us. Paul, thank you very much. Well, let's now get to some of our viewer questions this evening. And this one this evening comes to us via Twitter from Aaron asking, if forecast track shifts a bit more to the south, to the left of current, not good for Lake Pontchartrain and surge? Well, let's hand that question over to Dr. Knabb.
Mike, I think that the steering currents are well enough defined that we probably won't see this storm get far enough to the west to produce a significant storm surge in Lake Pontchartrain. They're not under a storm surge watch or warning. The storm surge warning is east of there, and especially concerned about the Mississippi coastline, where we could see salt water 3 to 5 feet above normally dry ground in coastal areas. One of the hot spots is the Bay St. Louis area, not necessarily right at the beachfront, but the water could be pushed into the bay and flood some of those areas. That's just one of the hot spots where if you get 3 feet of water above normally dry ground, you might think, oh, that's not so much, but it's really, really life-threatening once you get to about 3 feet. So if we fill up a tub and you are in it, 3 feet of water about halfway up your body, that would be life-threatening. And then if you get to some of these areas that could be above 3 feet, 3, 4, 5 feet, that's getting close to my head. That's very life-threatening. So if you're told to evacuate from any of these areas, you absolutely need to go earlier tomorrow rather than later. So stay with us here on the Weather Channel. We have so much more on Tropical Storm forecast to be Hurricane Gordon.
Well, for millions in South Florida, not the best of beach days on this Labor Day holiday, that's for sure. Tropical Storm Gordon putting an end to that, spinning off a low-pressure system named this morning, bringing downpours, gusty winds, nearly 50 miles an hour in some places in the Keys 65. Storm certainly packing a punch. And now, in about 24 hours, expected to make a landfall. Dan Schneiderman has more.
Tropical Storm Gordon lashed the Florida Keys Monday morning, bringing high winds and heavy downpours across much of the southern tip of the Sunshine State.
A little afraid to drive because the wind is so strong and the rain is so bad.
Downed power lines cut electricity to more than 4,000. As officials warn tourists and residents alike to stay out of the rough seas, closing Miami-Dade County beaches due to the high risk of rip currents. The deluge prompting warnings of localized flooding before the storm moves on.
I didn't expect it to end up like this. I thought it was just going to be out of bands, rain, not like this.
After pounding Florida, Tropical Storm Gordon is expected to make a quick dash across the Gulf of Mexico, taking aim at the coastline from Louisiana to the Florida Panhandle and bringing the threat of strong winds, heavy rain, and dangerous storm surge to millions across the southeast. Dan Schneiderman, NBC News.
And we now have the new 8 o'clock advisory in from the National Hurricane Center. Let's hand it over to Dr. Nab. What do we know?
Well, the maximum sustained winds are indeed up to 60 miles an hour, what we kind of expected based on the NOAA and Air Force Hurricane Hunter aircraft data. So that's up 10 miles an hour from the previous advisory. Now, technically speaking, it's up 5 knots because 45 knots was 50 miles an hour and now 50 knots is 60 miles an hour. There's a little bit of slop there in the conversions, but in any event, it's up a bit and it's on a strengthening trend. And the pressure's down a few millibars to 1,003. So as it clears away from Florida, this relatively small system trying to develop its inner core and taking advantage of the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Incidentally, also with this advisory, the tropical storm warning for the southwest coast of Florida has been discontinued. They can take down warnings on intermediate public advisories. They usually don't put them up. That would take a special advisory. But we'll see what happens with any watches warnings at 11 p.m. So, Mike, it's still moving quickly. No change to the track, obviously, because there hasn't been a new one, but that'll happen within the next 3 hours.
All right, we've got some viewer questions for you tonight, Dr. Nab. Thank you for sending those. We do them on Twitter. J.D. Pardon says this: how do you guys forecast or calculate it moving so quickly across the Gulf?
Well, a couple of things I can say in response to that very good question. Number one is, in order to forecast the forward speed of a tropical storm or hurricane, the forecaster has to first calculate the initial speed. And so that's basically by tracking the position over a several hour period and then basically calculating how far it's gone, miles per hour. Then you feed that all into the initialization of all the computer models. And then when we look at all of the forecast models, then what you do is basically follow the guidance that the models are giving you. And in this particular case, the steering currents are really well defined and the models are consistent in forecasting this general west-northwestward to northwestward motion. In some cases, Mike, it's a lot harder to do because the steering currents are poorly defined, like with Lane out in Hawaii recently. Right. But with this high off to the north and northeast, the steering currents are very well defined, but the change in forward speed after landfall is a little more difficult to forecast in this case. Right. Up to landfall, it's a little clearer.
Let's talk about what could be happening 24 hours from right now. We could be looking at landfall of a potentially Category 1 hurricane, maybe even stronger potentially. What's the message you want to relay right now to people that live in coastal Florida, in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Louisiana?
I'll say 3 things. Number one, it's not just going to be a coastal event. So don't think that if you live a little bit inland or a long way inland that this isn't your problem. Number 2, it's not just about wind, it's about water, both saltwater, storm surge flooding, and inland freshwater flooding. But the other thing is, Mike, is that you got to be ready for all of this before the center comes ashore. With a fast-moving system with some bad weather out ahead of it, earlier in the day tomorrow would be a lot better than later in the day, because if it speeds up or if the weather gets really bad ahead of the landfall, you could be caught not being done with everything you want to have done. So that's why this graphic is so useful. The earliest reasonable time of arrival of winds of tropical storm force in Mobile, Alabama, for example, is about 2 p.m. tomorrow. So you don't want to just bank on the exact forecast being exactly correct and say, well, it's going to be tomorrow night. Well, what if you're caught unawares and it speeds up? So get things done in the morning and listen to your local officials about any potential coastal evacuations.
I feel like a lot of times one of the big things that people are really worried about when there's a landfalling tropical system is losing electricity.
Yeah.
We think there's a decent opportunity here for power outages.
Yes, and again, not just in the coastal regions, but well inland as well. And that's the negative side of this fast-moving storm, right? Because the fast motion is limiting the time it's going to have over water to strengthen. But however strong it is at landfall, that fast motion translates into stronger winds being transported a lot farther inland. So just quickly, if you look at the chances of sustained winds of tropical storm force out of this event, it's greater than 70% well inland into southern Mississippi, and it's even at least a 1 out of 4 shot into northern Mississippi and even into southern Arkansas. So we could see some down trees and some power outages. And don't run your generator indoors, don't light candles, don't touch down power lines.
All right, let's get to another viewer question this evening. Again, if you want to include the hashtag WUTV or tag any of us here this evening, you can. This is from Christopher. Is there a chance for tornadoes when Gordon makes landfall?
Yes, and even before landfall, because if you think of the direction of motion and envision that the right front quadrant relative to the direction of motion is the problem spot for isolated tornadoes, and they can occur far away from the center of circulation, that means that a lot of folks who live in the Florida Panhandle, maybe even southern Georgia, southern Alabama, and you're not in the cone, you still could get some far-flung outer bands and get some isolated tornadoes. And over the water, could see water spouts. It's going to be short-lived, relatively weaker tornadoes than what you'd see in Iowa, for example, but still part of the equation of why you have to be on alert outside the cone.
You could be thinking, gosh, we're not in the cone, we should be okay. And next thing you know, a little tornado spins through your neighborhood, and you're like, where did that come from?
So make sure you have a way on your phone to get warnings.
All right, Dr. Knapp, great stuff. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. We'll answer them again next hour. Include this hashtag with your question. We'll get it answered live, WUTV. Still to come in our next hour, more on Tropical Storm Gordon and live reports from the Gulf Coast with meteorologist Paul Goodloe. We'll be right back. Right now, Tropical Storm Gordon hitting South Florida, bringing strong winds, blinding rain, and Gordon's legacy, though, may be what happens over the next 24 hours. Poised to intensify and then move through the Gulf of Mexico before hitting the northern Gulf Coast states. Meteorologist Paul Goodloe breaks down both the surge and heavy rain threats live from New Orleans, and our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knapp, in studio tracking Gordon's track, its timing, and its intensity, doing it hour by hour. We're bringing you live special coverage here on the Weather Channel. I'm meteorologist Mike Bettis. Let's update you on what we know right now with Gordon. In the last advisory issued just a short time ago at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, the intensity of Gordon has increased 10 miles per hour. It's now a 60 mile per hour tropical storm. Tracking west-northwest at 17 miles per hour. Pressure's dropped just a little bit by about 3 millibars. Now pressure stands at 1,003 millibars. Obviously, there are big concerns with this, especially knowing that it is forecast to intensify potentially to a hurricane. Our hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knapp, joining us live here in the lab tonight to discuss what could come of Gordon. Dr. Knapp, when you look at the intensity right now, what the forecast is to come, what's most concerning to you, and what are the risks going forward?
Well, it makes it a lot easier to believe that it could become a hurricane, right? When you're at 60 miles an hour and you got to get to 74, we're getting a lot closer, even though there's only about a day, plus or minus, before the center comes ashore. So it's got time, unfortunately, to strengthen, and because it's a relatively small tropical storm, it has the ability to ramp up more quickly than if it was larger and sprawling. So the aircraft data we've gotten so far confirm what we thought was going to happen. that it's getting stronger, but it sure is critical to have those brave men and women flying the NOAA and Air Force hurricane hunters into the storm. We wouldn't know nearly as well how strong it is just from radar and satellite data. It's a little easier to determine the forward motion, obviously, on radar and satellite. It continues to go west-northwestward at a pretty fast clip at 17 miles per hour. So that means it doesn't have as much time as it otherwise would over water to strengthen, but also means our time to prepare on the northern Gulf Coast isn't all that long. It's tonight and tomorrow morning. Here's the NOAA plane that came out of their base in Lakeland, and they found those stronger winds when they flew through the center from southeast to northwest a while ago off the coast of Florida. And by the way, the tropical storm warnings southwest coast of Florida have been discontinued on this intermediate public advisory. And here's the Air Force mission that is still ongoing. They went from northwest to southeast, turned around, going the other direction. And we'll get another pass from them. And we're going to have continuous aircraft missions between now and landfall, especially easier to do that when your bases are just right inland from where the storm is getting its act together. So it's not really clear what's going on in the inner core from the land-based radar data. It's starting to get a little farther away, harder to see what's going on, but certainly looks like the banding features are taking shape and it is on a strengthening trend.